안녕하세요, 박승춘입니다. 지금까지는 강의실에서만 강의를 했었는데 오늘은 밖으로 한번 나와봤습니다. 제가 오늘은 어디로 갈지, 무슨 이야기를 할지 궁금하시죠? 자, 이제 저와 같이 함께 가보시겠습니다. Hi, how are you, Mr. Janja?
Good to see you.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah. How are you, Mr. Jamja?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for inviting me this
Oh,
morning.
you're very welcome. Thank you very much for taking part in our conversation.
It's my pleasure, and I'm curious too.
Oh, it will be a great opportunity for Korean teachers to learn about German reunification.
But also for me as a German to reflect about their own past.
Oh, that would
So
be-
it's
oh, yeah.
of mutual interest.
Mutual interest, yeah. By the way, what time is it there in Berlin? What's the time difference between here and there?
Well, I think they're still sleeping. It's early morning in Korea, and it's still dark and cold in Germany. We are 8 hours ahead here.
8 hours
in
ahead.
winter time. Yes.
Oh, in winter time.
Yes.
So there is 8 hours of time difference
Yes.
between Korea and Germany.
Yes.
But when I'm thinking about the time difference between here and there, I feel like there is 27 years of time difference in terms of unification.
Yes.
Because Germany got reunified in 1990, but South Korea is still, the Korean peninsula is still divided into two countries in the year of 2017. So there is 27 years of time difference. So in that aspect, I envy Germans very much because we wish for unification in many reasons.
Yes, I do understand your comment. We are 8 hours ahead here, but still at the same time 27 years behind
Right.
in terms of unification.
Oh, yeah.
So I do see that picture. But in Germany, the facts people know about Korea, about the Korean Peninsula, is the fact of division, and that is actually what causes a great sympathy in Germany, because one shares the same history, the same suffering of having a divided nation.
Yeah.
So Germans do have that, and Europeans as such, they do have it on their mind.
As it has been 72 years of division since 1945, after
Yes.
the Second World War, 72 years of
Yes.
division. That's why people in many parts of the world, including Korea, think division in the Korean Peninsula is de facto.
Yes.
But we need to get over it. That's why we are shooting this interview.
Yes, there has been a time in Germany too when people thought it would be forever. And maybe even in the mid-1980s, maybe even in the late 1980s. In 1988, I wouldn't say nobody, but there were only a few people who actually thought that only 1 year later the Berlin Wall might fall down and the confrontation would end and there would be a peaceful change, a peaceful revolution ongoing. That came for the majority, I would say, as a surprise.
That's very interesting to me because many Korean people, including me, thought Germans were ready to get reunified. But you said that even in the late 1980s, people didn't think unification would come so quickly and all of a sudden.
That's quite true. There were major preparations ongoing, but still it was rather vague and the actual hope was rather limited to only a few experts who actually took care of the topic daily. For the general public, let's say for my fellow students at the time, they weren't really focused on East Germany. Actually, they were, especially the younger generation, they went on holiday to Spain or France, to the Mediterranean. They spent their time and their ideas and their focus on other subjects, but not on Eastern Germany. Because we had church contacts to East from West Germany to East Germany through some church organizations. I've been there a few times, and that was rather exotic, and people in West Germany wondered why I went to this so mentally distant East Germany.
So you are saying most West Germans didn't even go to East Germany. At the same time, I feel like it's pretty much the same in the Korean Peninsula, because most Korean younger generations want to go abroad,
yes,
but they are not thinking about going to North Korea, right, in many regions.
Right.
But anyway, does it come from the wall, the Berlin Wall, that's set up between East and West Germany? Could you please tell me about the Berlin Wall, when it was set up and how it came down?
Well, Germany was de facto divided since 1945, after the Second World War. There were 4 victory powers that divided Germany into 4 parts, and also the city of Berlin was divided into 4 parts. And between those 3 western parts of the city and East Berlin, in 1961, because more and more people, East Germans, made it to either Western Berlin or West Germany as such, the East Berlin, the East German regime, closed its own borders to make sure that the brain drain that actually was ongoing for those, for the medical personnel, for the scientists, for those who hoped for a better life in the West, that would stop eventually, and that was the reason why they closed the border.
When I visited Berlin, I stood in front of the Berlin Wall that's still kept in the specific area. It was very tall and high. It was not even possible for me to get over it. But when I watched the pictures and other video clips, I saw a lot of people from east side of Berlin try to escape by going through the wall or the barbed wire.
Yes, it was barbed wire on the first days when they set up the border, actually. And later in the weeks and months to come, more and more parts were set up in concrete. So just the Berlin Wall had a length of more than 230 kilometers. And it was not only the wall itself, but there was a whole security area actually way behind the wall itself. And it was fatal. It was possibly a deadly mission, a fatal mission if one tried to cross without permission. And many people tried in the 1960s and later on until the wall finally came down in 1989. But actually many had paid with their own lives. So around 100 or more than 130 people died along the Berlin border. And I would say that is at least the information the German prosecution officers have gathered and have set up in their research studies. Actually, in total, more than 1,000 people became victim on the inner German border, on the border between East and West Germany, in between 1961 and 1989. So
I remember one of the photos of a young soldier coming from east side, trying to get over the barbed wire and showing like this. It was very famous picture, but at the same time I was very much, how would I say, touched by his efforts trying to get over the Iron Curtain or the Berlin Wall. Would you tell me about the efforts East Germans made to find their freedom or to get away from East side?
I mean, the East Germany and East Berlin were sealed off, and some people adjusted to the situation. Some people tried, which was difficult enough to get along with their daily lives, but others tried to get out, and they were quite creative in finding ways to get out. Some actually digged tunnels, some took balloons, some took cars or trucks to find their ways out. But all of that surely was dangerous and difficult. And you've mentioned this one famous incident, and I think it was a soldier named Schumann at the time, and he escaped just 2 or 3 days after the parts of Berlin were separated and the wall had not fully been set up. So he could get across more easily actually than in the month and years after. So, but actually it's a very famous picture in Germany too. I would say that maybe not all, but many school children know it because it's in many textbooks. So this is a symbol of the freedom-loving, East Germans.
Symbol of freedom.
Yes.
Stepping on the barbed wire.
Yes, and crossing it.
Crossing it, yeah. And when I stood in front of the Berlin Wall, I felt like it was kind of intimidating because of the size of it and because of the atmosphere that I might feel from the wall, the high tall wall.
Yes.
But I heard that the wall came down by mistake. Is that true?
Well, in a sense, yes. On November, on 9th of November in 1989, there was this famous press conference that actually had always or almost been over at the time. And there was, if I recall correctly, there was an Italian journalist who just before the final close-up of the press conference after the East Germany's council meeting, who had one final question, and he wondered to Günter Schabowski, who was in charge of the press conference and representing the spokesman of the East Berlin government. The journalist was wondering of actually when those newly introduced travel regulations would be set into effect, and Günter Schabowski was checking his files and couldn't really find an answer to this question. So he said he assumed that it probably would be from right now, from immediately, with immediate effect. And that actually was the tip of the iceberg that made people start walking, start driving towards the border checkpoints, towards the border, and try to find a way across first to West Berlin and then from East Germany to West Germany. But if I may add, the foundations for that were laid out in the weeks and months before. So there was protest going on. People showed their opposition to the East German government. They took the ways out of East Germany they could find through Austria, through Hungary and Austria, and the Czech Republic at the time, and some of the embassies there. So basically, it was the initial point that actually created a dynamic process so that the wall could come down at that moment. So it had the effect of speeding it up, I would say.
Günter Schabowski is a very famous person in that aspect because he ignited the spark.
Yes.
And then people, actually it was not the Günter Schabowski, it's the whole people in east side of Berlin who went over the Berlin Wall. That's how Berlin Wall came down.
Yes.
The Günter Schabowski sparked.
Yes. Yes, I think that picture pretty well describes the situation. The people were on the streets. The people were courageous enough from the summer of '89, especially in the fall of '89. They went to the streets, some 10,000 in early October in Leipzig, and later on in East Berlin. In early November, there were hundreds of thousands on the centrally located Alexanderplatz in Eastern Berlin. And if I recall correctly, maybe 750,000, 800,000 people to demonstrate, to show a sign of opposition to their own government. When I saw the demonstrations here in Seoul in the autumn of 2016, the candlelight
last year,
yes, and also hundreds of thousands of citizens went on the street to put forward their political demand for transparency and a change and a more transparent and Korean government and society. That reminded me at the time, even though the situation is very different, of course. Korea is a democratic nation, and East Germany was very far away from that at the time. But still, to some extent, it reminded me of the will of the people to put forward peacefully, to peacefully put forward their opinion.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, when I was in Berlin last year, I stayed in a hotel in the Alexanderplatz.
Yes, so you've been at the historic site.
Yeah. There were a lot of people, like it happened in 1989, but I feel like there was some asking or the aspiration for democracy and their freedom.
I think that is maybe rooted and can be explained by rather the differences between the German situation and the situation on the Korean Peninsula today, because East Germans knew quite well how the situation in West Germany was like. They had West German TV. They were able to meet West Germans through sports events, church groups, and so forth. So they had information, and they had communication channels on the personal level, but also on the political level. So, and because of that, that fueled their will for change, because they wanted to live like West Germans. They wanted to enjoy. They wanted to enjoy the same economic and the same political freedom, the same prosperity and the same freedom to decide upon their own lives. So that is what fueled the change, and that is what made them either to leave the country if they could, or to go on the streets and ask for change within East Germany.
So you are saying that as they were aware of the West German situations in terms of politically and economically, they wanted their freedom by going to West Germany, and that's why they asked for travel regulation be easier for them.
Yes. As far as I can see, and as far as I understand the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and one should be reluctant to compare, of course, because the circumstances are different, but still I think East Germans knew at the time much more about West Germany than these days North Koreans know about South Korea. So, of course, I assume, and I would think that bringing information to North Koreans, to North Korea, about life in South Korea, about a free democratic life, that is quite an important task, and that would help to make people think and think about their situation and maybe think about change.
So you are saying the information is really important to open people's mind.
Yes.
So North Korean people don't have much information on South Korea like East Germans had information on West Germany.
Yes, I think the transparency, the TV that they could watch, that helped a lot to keep them informed and to understand the West German society, the West German system, and that fueled the change a lot. And the strength of West Germany was that West Germany was a democratic, free, a prosperous society that was well integrated in the community of free, modern, Western-style countries. And that was very attractive to East Germans. And that is what helped them to make up their minds about which way they want to go. So change in East Germany came from within East Germany.
Change coming from within East Germany. And also you said very interesting about the fueling the change. It came from people in East Germany. But in Korea, information is blocked and controlled by both government. That's why I think information cannot open people's mind for unification. That's one of the things that we need to get over.
In both ways.
In both ways. And there were also efforts made by politicians in West Germany, like Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt is very famous politician, especially to South Koreans. Would you please tell me a little bit about who Willy Brandt is and what he did?
Well, Willy Brandt was a new chancellor when he came to office in the late 60s. But in a sense, he continued a tradition that has been laid out by Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of the West German Republic, and he developed the policy of the first governments further, and he tried to open West Germany's and try to improve West Germany's relations to East Germany and to the Eastern Bloc as such. He tried to foster on reconciliation, and he had a dual approach, actually that was unchanged by all the governments that followed. So he knew that West Germany needed to be integrated in the Western Bloc solidly, but he also knew and he was convinced that change could only be ongoing and could only be sparked if communication was going on, if there would be channels that information can flow in both ways. Even if one doesn't agree, he was convinced one should keep talking to each other to keep information flowing. And I would say that even in the darkest hours of the Cold War, there was always communication and conversation going on between the Bonn government, the West German government, and East Berlin, and the Bonn government and Moscow and the Soviet Union at the time. So even when it was very difficult, one still talked to each other.
Your story reminds me of the Willy Brandt kneeling down.
Yes.
Would you please tell me about the photo?
Yes, well, again, this is one of the very symbolic moments in German and European history that Willy Brandt, who personally was not guilty at all, because he was in opposition to the Nazi dictatorship in between 1933 and 1945. So he personally was far away of being, in that respect, guilty, but still being a German leader, the Chancellor of Germany, of West Germany at the time, he thought and he decided that for Germany, for Germans as such, it would be a step forward into the future, into future times, to ask for forgiveness. And he did very clearly and very precisely. And I do think that was appreciated much, that symbol was seen, because it always takes two. It takes somebody who says sorry, and it takes somebody to accept, you know, that saying sorry. So it always takes two sides. And I think you've been talking about the economic side. It was important that West Germany was economically successful, but without laying the political foundations for all of this, I think German unification would have either not been possible, or it would have been much more difficult to reach that goal. So it was important to be on good terms with the neighbors, which is true for the Western neighbors, but also true for the Eastern neighbors. In 1989 and in 1990, none of the neighbors, none of the four victory powers, but none of the other Germany has 9 neighboring countries, immediate neighbors, and none of them had a veto against unification. So that didn't come of a sudden either. That was prepared in the years and decades before by all German governments, actually.
We are very much interested in the international politics around the Korean Peninsula, because China is a superpower.
Yes.
At the same time, USA is a superpower. Yes. So they try to take their, they try to make their influences on the Korean Peninsula. But from my perspective, I feel like the former Soviet Union and USA were too busy to take good care of German situation, because the former Soviet Union was very busy to make its economic development, and then USA was busy to have their war in Iraq in those times. Do you feel like that kind of international politics influenced West Germans' efforts to make German reunification?
So you've been describing the international framework and the situation at the time in the late 80s and early 90s. That surely helped unification. And one has to admit that it was coincidental, that it was a lucky moment.
Coincidental and yes, lucky moment,
It surely was a lucky moment in history that the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union had a weak period, that Gorbachev was first the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and later the President of the Soviet Union, who had a reform approach on the one hand, that helped a lot, because they retreated their influence they withdrew their influence on the East German government, and the signals were very clear from Moscow to East Berlin that they would not back any violent, any military crushing of the people's uprising. So that was quite an important factor in the peaceful revolution. Actually, that is true. West Germany was integrated in international institutions and organizations. For example, NATO for Western Europe. That same as South Korea hooked West Germany onto the United States in regard to defense issues.
Still, I'm very much interested in the fact that West Germans didn't think that unification would come that fast.
That's very true. That is especially true for the younger generation. So, as I've mentioned before, they were focused on other things, but not on East Germany and unification issues.
What about the East Germans? Did they want to have a unified Germany, or did they want freedom and democracy?
Well, I would say that clearly at the beginning it was freedom, economic freedom and political freedom and democracy. And later on, like when in the autumn of 1989, when the protests were ongoing, when change was coming up, the opportunity for change upcoming on the horizon, then at some point East Germans changed their calling for a change in East Germany to the call for unification. So some of them, and of course West German politicians too, had unification in their mind from the beginning. But and both of the countries, East Germany and West Germany, wanted unification as part of their state doctrine from the beginning, but only on their terms. That reminds me of the situation here on the Korean Peninsula. But there was a certain moment in the autumn of 1989 when on the demonstrations one would not hear "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people anymore, but rather hear "Wir sind ein Volk," we are one people. So that clearly there was this moment when the change in the protest campaign was noticeable.
They're saying that "Wir sind ein Volk."
Yes.
They're asking for unification.
Yes.
From "Wir sind das Volk."
Yes.
Asking for democracy.
Yes.
So democracy first in the east side, and then unification. Like I said earlier, I think you are at least 27 years ahead of us in terms of unification. Would you like to say some things to Korean people who want to have unification?
Well, it is difficult to get advice, I guess, because the situations are quite different. But still, from the very German experience, I would say, of course, it is good to prepare. It is good to be prepared, but from our experience, it is also necessary, or at least helpful, if one stays flexible. Because the unification process is very dynamic. It's an enormous management challenge. And it cannot be predicted, of course. And there will be very crossroads and important things to decide out of a very dynamic process. So one can prepare a lot, but at the end one has to create and steer a complex process. So both is needed: a good preparation, but also to be ready to take a challenge, a dynamic challenge that causes changes. I would say for both parts of a nation that comes together.
I would like to hear more about how Germans made an effort to get over some obstacles after reunification.
Yes.
Next time when we talk.
Yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so very much, Mr.
You're
Lamde.
welcome. Talk to you soon again.
My pleasure.
me personally, I'm from the younger generation, and obviously as I'm 25, I was born after the unification. So for my generation, actually these categories, Aussie and Wessie, they don't really matter anymore. When I meet new people my age, they don't ask me if I'm from the East or from the West. But for my parents' generation, of course, that was still an issue. So in my family, my dad's side of the family, they're from the West. But my mom's side of the family, they're from the East. So of course, my family kind of combines like these two categories. And in daily life, there are only, slightly like cultural differences. For example, from our everyday family life, in the East, they use different terms for their parents. So they say mutti and fati, but in the West, they say mama and papa. So actually, I combine both of them. For my mom, I'm using the Eastern term, mutti, and for my dad, I'm using the Western term, papa. So that's kind of like one of these small situations where you can see that there's still a difference, but they are getting combined in everyday lives of families. I mean, in terms of the numbers, like when we look at, for example, the wages that people have, I don't think so. It's getting closer. The gap is getting smaller, but at the same time, people in the East still earn less than their counterparts from the West. And of course, I can understand that this is something frustrating for people from the East. So, yeah.
What do you want Korean teachers or Korean people to learn about lessons from German education?
Sometimes when I talk to Koreans in my age, I think they're a bit too focused on the practical terms of unification. Like they often ask me about the costs that will be there, or like how you can unify the country at an economic level. And I think that's great. That's something you have to talk about for sure. But I think for my generation of Koreans, it would be good to get a bit more emotional involved in this issue, to actually like inside that they really want unification to happen and not just think about it in like really rational terms.